Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Nirit, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Would you like to introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Sure. So my name is Nirit Soffer-Dudek. I'm a clinical psychologist and a faculty member at Ben-Gurion University in the Negev in Israel at the Department of Psychology. I'm a researcher and a clinician. I research consciousness states and their relationship to psychopathology and personality and stress. And one of my research topics is maladaptive daydreaming, which I've come to talk to you here today.
How'd you come across maladaptive daydreaming? Like, where's your interest for it?
Well, it actually started when Professor Eli Zomer approached me after he had seen, he's the one who coined the term. And he had seen a paper of mine that was published in 2015. The topic of the paper was the relationship between dissociative absorption, which I'll explain in a bit, the relationship between that and obsessive compulsive tendencies or symptoms. And he realized that that topic was very close to this thing that he was just starting to research. And we teamed up. And he sent me just a few emails, just a few examples of the emails he had been getting. And it was so interesting. It was just amazing to read about. And, I realized that he was really onto something that isn't known to clinicians, but should be, and to researchers. And it just seemed really interested. And we started a collaboration. And ever since, we've been friends and colleagues, and we've collaborated on many projects together. So I'll just say a word about what dissociative absorption is. So dissociation is a clinical concept. It's defined as a disintegration between mental elements or psychological functions. So, for example, if I tell you about a really traumatic memory, but I don't feel any emotion when I tell you about it because, that's too much to handle. So I kind of do this like intellectualization, and I kind of tell you about it in a really non-emotional way. And like the emotion is kind of, I stick it in a drawer deep in my mind and I don't want to touch it while I tell you about it. That's a dissociative process. So it's a kind of a hazy concept, but that's just about the gist. And dissociative absorption is actually a subscale in a very popular questionnaire about dissociation. And this subscale it taps onto normative dissociation, to processes that every person has now or then. But the question is, what frequency do they have it? So, for example, driving somewhere that you know well and not noticing what's going on because you're spacing out, and then realizing that you got there, but that you don't remember the trip. That's something that has happened to almost any experienced driver. And that's assumed to be a process which involves both dissociative absorption and dissociative amnesia, where you kind of drive on an autopilot mode, and you're very absorbed in like daydreaming and not on the road. But then you still manage to stop at red lights and do all that stuff and drive fine and not get in an accident. And then you don't remember the road because your consciousness was focused or absorbed in something else. And also, getting so absorbed in a movie or in a book or on your daydreaming, so absorbed and immersed to the point where you kind of become oblivious to your surroundings. Like if I would call you, I would say, Robbie, and you wouldn't hear me, or you would answer on autopilot and then not remember that we talked or that you answered or what you answered. That would, again, be a dissociative process. So again, it happens to everyone to a certain extent, but people who are high in this construct are people who have these experiences all the time. So they kind of tend to live their lives in a less integrated way and more like in parts, more dissociative. This is normal dissociation, but again, this specific scale, it's normal to a certain extent. And what I've shown in a few studies that I've done is that if you're high on this scale, then that's related to various psychological symptoms, and especially obsessive compulsive symptoms. So if you want, I can explain why.
I just got a couple questions, but leading up to the higher part of the scale, does that build with time? Does that dissociativeness, whatever that you're experiencing, does that happen? I mean, it has to be lack of interest. I think everyone dissociates. I'm probably saying that wrong, but
yeah, you said that fine, actually.
Okay, good. But there's probably plenty of times people do that on their daily basis, but much like how there's a significant difference between maladaptive daydreaming and then regular daydreaming, it's probably something like that where eventually you start losing interest in a lot of things where you kind of dissociate. And then it becomes like an everyday thing so much where you're missing giant. It probably linked in with time blindness at some point. People looking, well, where'd the time go? Because I don't know, it's a lack of boredom. I do it when I drive too. I don't remember sometimes getting home. I don't mean to. I just thought I was dealing with some type of like Alzheimer's or something. I have no clue. It was freaking me out for a little bit, but then I just realized that I've taken the same road 1,000 times, every year just to get home. So it's kind of like I know the drive, I know the speed limit, I know everything. There's not a need to think. You just try to get home. So that can be very risky because then you can find yourself doing that most of the time. The next, you blink and you're like 50 years old or 60 years old. And you're like, where did the time go? We didn't take count of the moments, I guess. I don't know.
Okay, so
I said a lot.
You said a lot. I'm not sure, but I'll just react to some of the things that you said. So first of all, regarding maladaptive daydreaming, so dissociative absorption is actually something that's not exactly like maladaptive daydreaming, but it's related. Like people who maladaptive daydream usually become very absorbed and kind of can maybe do things on autopilot while they're daydreaming. So they have this ability or this trait. I don't know if to call it an ability is exactly accurate. It's an ability and it's both disability. So they have this trait and they tend to become very, very absorbed and very immersed because their daydreaming abilities are so vivid, so lifelike, so so immersive. And that's what enables them to lose time, to be in it for like 6 hours in a row and not notice time passing by, and then waking up after several hours and saying, whoa, where'd the time go? So people who have a less immersive or a less lifelike imagination probably would not experience that as much because they would get bored, they would go back to reality, they wouldn't go into this alternative world. So it definitely it's definitely related to time loss. And but some people have dissociative absorption tendencies without having maladaptive daydreaming. So they're not the same. I mean, you could be high in dissociative absorption because you tend to get absorbed in movies and in books and in other things and not in immersive daydreaming. But again, you tend to become so absorbed that you tend to answer people or do stuff on autopilot, not notice what's going on around you, kind of be this dissociated self and not like an integrated higher self that's kind of overarching, kind of looking at what's going on and being able to be vigilant and know what's going on. So different people have, this is just a trait that's an individual differences trait. Some people are like this and some people aren't. And what I've shown is that if you're very high on dissociative absorption, you do have more psychopathological symptoms. And again, especially obsessive compulsive ones. And the reason is that, well, I mean, more research is needed, but at least one of the reasons is probably that when you kind of wake up from this, zoning out kind of thing, whether you were in daydreaming or whether you were doing something else or just blanking out, when you come back, that kind of raises anxiety for some people. Not necessarily for everyone, but for some people, it's very anxiety provoking to suddenly not be sure what happened, what I did, what I said, and then you start to ask yourself. So I see it as kind of a risk factor for obsessive compulsive disorder.
What are some of the high ones on the scale compared to what are some of the low ones? Because it sounds counterintuitive on this, but would ADHD be on the high scale for that? Mostly because I know people always talk about, well, ADHD means you don't have attention. It's like, no, we're just lacking it and it seems to be somewhere else. And if you talk about someone getting focused in on a movie and blocking out all the sounds around it, that's kind of average, just depending on how the severity is. But ADHD, I hyper focus into things, and then it's only that thing that matters and nothing else around me that really I start consuming. So I would think that would be one of those on the high scale. It sounds counterintuitive because everyone thinks attention, ADHD means you're lacking. It's not that you're without attention.
Right. No, I think that the problem with ADHD is regulating your attention. So, and also in the ADHD field, there's concept called hyperfocus, which you mentioned. I think though that in the ADHD field, and maybe, maybe I'm wrong, but because it's not exactly my field, but my impression is that it's not exactly understood how these things work together. How is it that you have ADHD, but then you're able to hyper focus? Because as you said, it sounds contradictory. People with ADHD tend to be high on the scale of dissociative absorption, but again, it seems like some of this is conceptual ambiguity. It's like things aren't defined accurately enough in a way that would be also different from the other definition. So it's really hard to say. I think that eventually people who have ADHD are able to hyper focus when it's something that's interesting for them and their problem is regulating or controlling their attention. And I'll also say that, though, that I did do a study in 2019 that actually showed that dissociative absorption and an ADHD scale were different constructs. I showed that they had a relationship, a positive relationship, but it wasn't that high. And they were two different constructs empirically. And I showed that dissociative absorption had predictive value over and above ADHD in predicting obsessive compulsive symptoms. So I actually checked that to see if it's not like just the explanation is that, ADHD and OCD are somehow related and that's just the explanation. So I showed that it's not the explanation.
How did you do that study? Did you have participants that were willing to sign up and explain?
I did this study. It was a cross-sectional study, just a self-report, kind of like 300, students that filled out questionnaires about ADHD, OCD, dissociative absorption. And this is just looking at the shared variances between the items.
Now, is there a treatment for the absorption that people can experience? Like, is there anything like practicing mind? When I spoke with people about ADHD, they were very pressing on the whole take your medication, Adderall, and all this. And I'm not against medication, but I'm also 25. And if it's a part of me, I would like to learn how to kind of deal with it and learn more about it so I can help understand myself more. Nobody's really for that in that field, which is fine. But I don't know. That's just my path. But I'm interested if there's a medication somebody could take, if there's mindfulness meditation, which I've never attempted before, but I think there's anything that works for somebody. Obviously, it's not going to work for the whole bit, but if there's a little bit of evidence and we take the time to go do a study, see if meditation works or anything like that, I feel like, give everything a shot because some people are experiencing real pain with some of this stuff, especially imagine not being able to soak up information that's going on around you only because you're too focused into something that just randomly tricks in your mind with you having no reaction to be able to control that at all.
Yeah. Well, dissociative absorption specifically, that's not considered a disorder. So there's no treatment for dissociative absorption accordingly. However, I would imagine that mindfulness training would help. Maybe medication also, I don't know. But mindfulness should help because it's you could say that mindfulness would be kind of the opposite than dissociative absorption. Because mindfulness is kind of like being aware, being noticing, and kind of like a meta consciousness state where you're noticing your mental state, where you're thinking about your thoughts. And that's very different from dissociative absorption, where you kind of you're very unaware, you're very in the moment, and which sounds good, and it can be good in certain situations, but if it happens too much, then yeah, maybe you should try to find ways to be more present, more noticing what's going on around you.
When it comes to some of the
So
present dangers with that absorption aspect, could that be future problems as well too? Like if someone's got a bill that they have to worry about or other adult things that they need to take care of, it can be probably a big hindrance on that.
are you asking if absorption is a risk factor for later problems?
Yeah, like if we talk about long-term goals or adult life problems, I would think that this would be a giant area it would really impact. Because if you're talking about in the moment or whatever that person's experiencing, you're not thinking about what's going to happen next week, the next day. I mean, it might be a dumb question.
Yeah. No, I think that it's an important question because maybe it is important to say that this dissociative state, I think, is quite normal in young children. So it's actually, I think, something that we would want a child to be like. We want the child to be absorbed in his or her play and not worry about other things. And sometimes in this day and age, I think that with raising children, there's the opposite problem where parents kind of intrude into that absorption and of that healthy absorption that kids have, and kind of like with the screens, the phones, or asking them a lot of questions, or they have to decide this or decide that because we treat them like small adults. um, I could talk an hour about that also, but I think that that there's a healthy absorption that happens, developmentally, and over time, kind of we develop that meta consciousness kind of part of our brains, which is probably the frontal lobe area, the PFC, prefrontal, and we become more aware of our environments and we become more regulated. Kids are not regulated. That's fine. What we do as parents is we help them over time become regulated, and they become better planners, they become better regulators, they become they can plan ahead and consider different aspects of something before they make a decision, and make decisions and not just be intuitive. So I think, yeah, that's the developmental process. So I'm not saying that if someone is high on dissociative absorption, they're childish. That's not what I am.
Yeah, I
Just
know.
suddenly realizing that you could understand that as, but that's not what I'm saying. But I'm just saying it is related to how much you can regulate your attention,
Much like
which is a development.
kids being in like a fantasy thing, if they're daydreaming or if they're doing whatever, that's more acceptable than if
That's
you're an
fine.
adult
Yeah,
that
that's
you're,
great.
yeah.
That's actually great. I think that that's part of normal development and healthy development. And we know that about a third of kids have an imaginary friend,
Yeah.
and that's completely normal. So there's nothing abnormal about that. So they're experimenting, with dialogues and social interactions in their minds, and they have a very vivid imagination. And because of that, sometimes children will have a harder time, differentiating reality and fantasy. Sometimes they could get confused, and again, that's fine and that's normal. But the older we get, the more responsibility we have, and the more we have to plan ahead and regulate ourselves and inhibit ourselves. And this is just part of our, developmental trajectory.
When we
And for some people, it's harder.
Yeah, when we talk about the dissociative disorder, is there a benefit to it that some people can experience? I mean, it's not like hyperfocus, and I know a lot of people call hyperfocus like an ADHD superpower. Let me tell you, it's not. It's kind of difficult, especially if you're focused into something that you don't want to be focused into, and it's kind of like an issue. It's all you're thinking about all the time. But I'm wondering if this has a positive to it, where if we talk about how people can maybe write a book, if you dissociate from everything around you, depending on intensity, how much they do it. I mean, I know some people that take that writing very seriously and they won't talk to you for months while they're working on a project, which makes it very, very difficult if you're trying to hear from them and check if they're still alive. But they crank out some great work when they do something like that. So I'm curious if you ever came across any benefits to it. And I understand that everyone does it, but I'm just curious if there's a certain area, maybe a specific job or anything type of a hobby.
Okay, so I have a few things to respond to that. So first of all, you've been asking me about dissociative absorption, which is something I'm really interested in, but we haven't really talked about maladaptive daydreaming. So I would first of all say that in terms of daydreaming abilities, there are definitely people who control their daydreaming abilities and they have the ability for immersive daydreaming. And it's not maladaptive for them because they control it, so it doesn't take over their lives. And there are definitely some people that I've talked to who have a creative career or, you know, a hobby which is creative, that they use it, that people who are writers or do a PhD or, you know, different things, that they found that it helps them. So yeah, I think that there are people who have this ability for really strong, really vivid imagination, that it helps them. So that's kind of like one thing. Also, we did a study on dissociative absorption among people who do not have psychopathology, and we gave them like cognitive tasks. And we found out that according to, you know, in accordance with our hypothesis, although they had more errors in different cognitive tasks, there was one cognitive task which had a visual element to it, and we thought that they would be better at it. And indeed, that was what happened. It was a mental rotation task where you get these shapes, and two shapes, and you have to say if it's the same shape, and you have to rotate it in your head to kind of see if it's the same shape or not. And they were much faster. So they were worse at some things, but they were much better at this. So they have a better, you know, visualization kind of quality. And so, you know, that could definitely be like, if you're, I don't know, a interior designer of a house, like I
Yeah.
could imagine that that would be beneficial for you. And also, we did a study. Have you heard of the term flow?
I've heard of the term before, but you might need to explain it again.
Yeah, so flow is considered this altered kind of state of consciousness where you feel like the thing that you're doing, like some kind of task or sport that you're doing at the moment, you feel like it's really flowing,
Oh yeah,
that
yeah.
you're like in the zone. And it's defined as kind of like a balance between your skills and the difficulty. So it's not too easy, but it's not too hard, and you're really kind of in your zone. Um, and there are certain aspects of flow that are defined in a similar way to dissociation, like a change in your concept of time. But flow is considered a positive thing, and it's been related to, you know, positive kind of consequences. And dissociation is considered a negative thing, and it's related to psychopathology. So we did a study about flow and dissociation, and we thought our hypothesis was that self-efficacy, which is the degree to which I feel efficacious, I feel agentic, I feel that I can control things and influence things. So self-efficacy, we thought that that would be a moderator, like the thing that would determine whether the flow or the dissociation or whatever would be positive or negative. So we had kind of like a partial success in that study to show that. There were also some findings that we didn't expect. So for instance, in the state phase, we gave participants a task. They had to play Tetris. And and we measured their mood afterwards. And we found out that actually those who were high in absorption or flow and all that, you know, immersive states, they had an increase in their mood if they had low self-efficacy and not if they had high self-efficacy, which surprised us. But then we realized that, you know, those with high self-efficacy may have been those who were more determined to be successful in the game and to, you know, to make as many, you know, complete as many rows as possible. And maybe they were less able to kind of really get into it. And so we think that that's the explanation for those weird results. So again, it was
That's
kind of like,
that's
yeah, it was
interesting with the low.
complicated.
That's the interesting with the low. I can't even pronounce that word. I don't think I've
Efficacy, yeah.
efficacy. Um, that's interesting that it was the low people that you saw that with. I would have to think because maybe it's just to them it's a game. It's not considered an actual task or anything that would be. I mean, it is a task, but it's not considered like a main investment, much like a job or an interview or anything like that would. So they're not so much paying attention to it, but they can still have that state of flow. But I bet
Yeah,
both
but
parties were happy.
you have to remember those, that these are students, undergrads, who come to a lab to do an experiment. So definitely some could see this as a game and just, okay, I came here to have fun. What do I care? I'll get the credit points anyway. And some could see this as, something that I really have to do well in. So that's really interesting as well. I think that's part of the normal variance that we have among our participants.
I bet both parties were happy though when they had that long piece that came in on the Tetris game because everybody needs that piece to complete so
Yeah.
much. We're gonna get some maladaptive daydreaming here in a minute. I just gotta. When it comes to the actual dissociative disorder, can that be created, or I guess I wouldn't say created, but intensified through things like video games or things that we have that do mindlessly take away our attention, like social media things and types of technology devices? I would have to feel like I have so many little nephews that get stuck in these immersive virtual reality things where nothing else matters. I mean, the number of knees I've seen busted on a coffee table just because they're so into this virtual reality game is ridiculous. Where I go, I mean, is that going to be a problem that we're going to eventually see down the line? I didn't know if you happen to think about that at all.
I thought about it a lot. I do think, and a lot of people think this, that being in social media and of course being in computer games, that goes without saying. But even being in social media, that kind of increases your dissociation. And I think that people all around now are more dissociative and more kind of, you can forget in 1 minute what you wanted to do 2 minutes ago, because you looked at your phone and checked the news, and it's kind of, you're always kind of jumping from one thing to the next, and it's very hard to kind of just be present in reality when you keep on jumping from this to that to that.
I would agree,
I
but
don't know though.
I have a
Yeah.
party line on that one. I think that changed after the pandemic. I don't know what happened, and I know it has not gotten back to normal with a lot of people. But there was like a weird thing where people cared less now. It seems like I don't know, maybe it's because I'm older, but it just seems like a lot of people are so easy to be like, no, this isn't for me, and just walk out of a job or just be stuck in their own little universe. And it wasn't really like that before. Before I was like, I'm the only one that's not tuned into the conversation or I'm not tuned into the world. Now I'm starting to see it kind of everywhere. And I realize everyone now has, I mean, like I said, everyone being at home for so long during the pandemic, they're started up their own tasks. They got their own things going on. A lot of people have businesses that they do on their own more now, whether it's a small business, whether it's a small hobby, whether they think about painting to ship out paintings. I don't know. But I'm noticing that with a lot more people that they never fully cut off the attachment of what they made during the pandemic, and they kept this going as like a hobby lifestyle. And that's the more of I'm seeing that more disassociativeness.
I don't know about that. I can say that definitely, scientifically there has been a change in people. I don't know specifically about the change that you're describing, but there are a lot of studies in the mental health field that show that ever since the pandemic, there have been rises in depression, anxiety, suicidality, the works. And maladaptive daydreaming also has risen. There was a study that showed that during lockdowns and all that, there was an increase in maladaptive daydreaming. So there was an increase in actually almost virtually every symptom, obsessive compulsive symptoms, everything increased. And as a clinician, I can also say that there have been increases in Israel in people seeking therapy. So all the clinics are full. It's really hard to find a psychologist even privately here in Israel. I don't know how it is in the States. So it's definitely ever since the pandemic, it's really different. So it's very interesting that this process. Yeah, I think that it'll take a lot of time to fully grasp and understand what the pandemic has done to the human race on all aspects.
I haven't sought out any psychologists down here, so I don't know how hard it is to get one, but maybe I should try at some point. When if there's an area that, and we're going to go to maladaptive daydreaming after this, but if there was an area that you could go and explore, whether it's something that might be a little bit down the line, where would you like to go when it comes to dissociative, just the disorder? Is there a certain study you'd like to do? If there's something you might think about looking into a little bit more compared to what you have done studies on?
Well, I have projects on the pipeline, so I can talk about the stuff that I'm going to do. So I have a study about maladaptive daydreaming and dissociation, about their relationship, which is a really big project, and it's kind of like partially funded. which is starting out now. So that's, part of trying to show that maladaptive daydreaming has dissociative aspects. And this could, benefit the field in terms of, if in a future version of a psychiatric manual, a diagnostic manual, they would consider inserting maladaptive daydreaming, it could be in the dissociative disorders chapter. So we kind of want to know, are these really similar? Is this appropriate to this nosology of, categorizing it as a dissociative disorder? Does that work? So that's kind of, one line of research that I have.
How is it not easily seen as recognized under the same criteria as that? Just because maladaptive daydreaming, you're tuned out of everything but your own fantasy and nothing else. Like I don't even hear anybody when they're talking to me when I'm on
dissociative absorption is not considered a disorder. So it's not that simple. I mean, it's actually considered, some people say that dissociative absorption actually shouldn't be called dissociation because it's not really the most extreme variant of dissociation, which is feeling like two people or more. I do feel like it is very related, and a lot of other dissociation researchers would agree that when you do things on autopilot and your awareness is elsewhere, you kind of have this, perhaps normal, but you have this disintegration between two parts. And I believe that that's the basis for dissociative identity disorder, known as, split personality among lay people. So I do believe that that's related to it. And I think also that maladaptive daydreaming is very related to that, not just because you zone out, because you could say, okay, so maybe it's a subtype of ADHD, but it's more than just zoning out. It's experimenting in your mind with different personalities or having an alter ego and feeling like two different people. And a lot of people who have maladaptive daydreaming, they say, when I come back to reality feels unreal to me, because the daydreams feel so real that reality kind of is gray and, boring and unreal and not the place that I really, really want to be in and feel like myself and feel real and feel like it's very vivid. And this feeling of unreality, that's also a dissociative symptom that's called derealization. There are dissociative symptoms called depersonalization, derealization, where you feel like yourself and the world, they feel strange and familiar. So that's kind of like a detachment feeling. So these are all things that are very related. And so I actually have a chapter where I showed how maladaptive daydreaming has various characteristics that are dissociative. But it could also be viewed, for example, as a behavioral addiction.
Yeah.
Even if you don't say it's a subtype of ADHD, you could say it's a subtype of a behavioral addiction. Like there's gambling disorder in the DSM and the diagnostic manual. So you could categorize it as something different. And also some people could say it's on the OCD spectrum.
Yeah.
There's the chapter on OCD. There are different other categories there that are considered an OCD spectrum, like skin picking. And we know that maladaptive daydreaming is very related to skin picking. Like 25% in one study
skin picking?
Skin picking, like just compulsively, picking at a scab.
I was doing it a minute ago with my hand. I was just picking the inside. I have calluses on my hands, so I was just picking one of the. But it helps me focus in, so I can actually pay attention to what's being said.
That's exactly the thing. It's the same. It seems to be a very similar mechanism to people who do maladaptive daydreaming and do stereotypical motions, because it helps them focus. It helps them trigger the fantasies in a more vivid way. So they do these motions. Some people pace, some people rock, some people twirl around, some people probably skin pick during their maladaptive daydreaming. I don't know. So it seems like there's this mind-body connection here where, something with the motoric system, you have to do something repetitive that kind of enables you to, in your mind, become more immersed in this internal world. So that's very interesting, and it seems to be related to the OCD spectrum. So there are different chapters in the DSM where you could put this suggested disorder.
Well, I mean, is it just the awareness of maladaptive? We're going to talk about maladaptive daydreaming now, but is it just the awareness aspect that's really? I feel like it's a lot of these disorders that haven't really been recognized for so long, or whether they're taking time to be recognized, is because I guess the wording for it. I think maladaptive daydreaming is a really good term for it, but I just think that the daydreaming aspect is what takes people out. As soon as I say it, if I'm talking to someone about it, like maybe you should look into this or something, someone with ADHD, a friend of mine or something, they'll be like, well, everybody daydreams. I'm like, you can't just, there's a difference. Let's talk about the difference. And then you start learning about it and you realize it's not the same thing, but it's also like mind wandering and other things. People hear a certain term, like when you mentioned the dissociative, and then you talked about some people call it split personality. See, I associate split personality with bipolar disorder or those other
No,
types.
that's not related. No, that's not. Yeah, that's mixing it. So, okay, so you said a lot of important things, so I have to choose what I'm going to respond to.
The whole topic is confusion. That's it.
Right. Yeah, no, that's really important because, first of all, you're right. I mean, it's very confusing. And in retrospect, I think the term is not the best one. And I'm actually writing about that, something which I hope will one day I'll finish and submit as a paper. I think the term should be changed, even though it's really kind of become popularized. But the term daydreaming is too broad, it's too vague, and it's been used in different ways. So first of all, I think that fantasizing is more accurate, but I would maybe call it, addictive fantasizing or something like that. So I want to say that one of the things that we're doing in my lab, I have a doctoral student whose topic of her dissertation is ADHD and maladaptive daydreaming. She's already published a study on that. So, and we're doing more work, and she's developed a questionnaire. We haven't published this yet, but we have very interesting results. A scale, a self-report scale that actually asks about the properties of the mental pattern. And she really she was able to find these characteristics that make the daydreaming, the maladaptive daydreaming that characterize it. So her work is on differentiating between mind wandering, which is the prototypical mental pattern of people with ADHD, and daydreaming and fantasizing or maladaptive fantasizing, which is different because it's more immersive. It's more like a storyline. It's more coherent. It's continuous. So you stop now and then you continue in 6 hours from the same point, like watching a series on Netflix. You continue on with what you were doing before. Very different from mind wandering. So mind wandering is just the distraction of jumping from one thing to another, and it's not necessarily a story or a narrative. And also in fantasizing, it's usually something which is less similar to reality. It could be like superheroes or something more fantasy-like. It doesn't have to be, but that's something that would, that's one characteristic that would steer us more in the direction of fantasizing than mind wandering. And in the mind wandering literature, they don't really, they don't look at these differences. So they just call everything mind wandering or daydreaming, and they use these concepts interchangeably, and they don't really make these distinctions, which are really important, I think, because I think it's a very different mechanism. People with maladaptive daydreaming, their problem is that they're addicted, and that's very, very different than someone who just happens to be very easily distracted.
Is a lot of these terms, like the mass confusion that's with it, probably a reason why a lot of it takes a while to get recognized as its actual own thing. Because there are similarities that I can see, but if you kind of look at them like separately, they're very, very individualistic, and they have their own kind of experiences that go with it. But would a lot of this come from better education about it? Would a lot of this come from changing terms for it? I mean, how do you get things recognized under certain branches when you have the data that you have?
Well, so again, what we do is we do a lot of research, and we're hoping that, when I say we, I mean me and Professor Zomer and a few other, researchers from around the world who have joined this endeavor, and, just getting good research out there. And the popularity of the term has been exponentially growing. The subreddit with, dedicated to it is now over 100,000 members. to it. So it's been really exponentially growing. And, I just hope that in the future it gets recognized so that clinicians can help their clients better. I give a lot of talks to clinicians in my area. And, people, just the clinicians who hear, they always say, wow, now that I think of it, I had a patient who had that, and they just didn't know how to call it or how to think of it. And that's so important that, as a clinical construct, which we know is related to a lot of suffering, we should have just more data about it. So I just tried to get the word out there.
When Dr. Sommer emailed you, and have you never heard of the term before about
No, I've
maladaptive
never heard
daydreaming?
of it
Okay.
before.
And you were very open to looking into it and understanding what it was. Sometimes I bring it up to some past guests who are psychologists or something, and they just dismiss me like it's nothing.
Well, first of all, you have to understand that I was a very young researcher, and Professor Zomer is like the authority in Israel on dissociation, and I was a dissociation researcher. And getting an email from Professor Zomer, saying, "Okay, listen, I read your article, and it looks like we're interested in the same thing. Read these emails that people sent to me." So, it's different than, he grabbed my attention, first of all. But then the important thing is that I read those emails and it was just fascinating, because here was a really, unknown clinical construct, which there was no way to conceptualize it in the concepts that we currently have. So this was really interesting, and it was really related to the things that I was interested in. So it was very different from the situation that you're describing.
How do you get invested in something that doesn't necessarily affect you? I mean, I don't know if you experience maladaptive daydreaming, but for me,
No,
I've
I
only
don't have that ability at all. I can't, like, if you would let me just sit around and daydream, I would get bored really quickly.
I got really invested in ADHD only because it not only impacts me, but I also think of like a kid who probably has a cell phone at the age of 6 or 7, and they go and try and look up ADHD and nightmares, which I experience quite frequently. And there's like 1 to 2 studies on it. There's nothing else about nightmares. It's enough about sleep, but not nightmares specifically. So I kind of bring this over with maladaptive daydreaming, where you got to think about a kid who has access to the internet who can look it up and be able to try and find resources to it. And if we don't accept it or we don't talk about it or we don't a lot of people don't bother acknowledging it, then what are we going to do when that kid tries to figure out some answers about himself? It to me, I'm just curious what your interest is. How do you stay motivated and keep pushing forward on this aspect?
Well, okay, so I have a few answers. First of all, I just want to say as a side note, because I'm also a dream researcher, that there are a few studies showing that ADHD is related to nightmares, but there's also studies that show that, do you know the concept morningness, eveningness?
No.
Like if you're a morning person
Oh
or an
yeah, yeah.
evening, like
Okay.
if you're a night person or a morning person, like when you're more energized. So ADHD is related to being a night person and also to having variability in your kind of, sleep schedule. And both of those things that I just mentioned are related to nightmares. So those might be the explanations, both being a night person and having a lot of variability and not having like a regular sleep schedule. Both those things are related to nightmares. So that was just a side note that's not related to maladaptive daydreaming. I'll let you think about that.
Well,
So
I was just gonna say, is it common for my sleep? Like my sleep's usually like 2 hours, but I dream and it feels like 8 years. I've never I've explained the most realistic dreams on this show already that just sound like I had been sleeping for what seems like 9 hours or something like that. But that's always how I've gotten these dreams. But they're always nightmares, and it's very intense. And I found like 1 or 2 different studies, and I try to get someone to talk about it with ADHD because I didn't know if that was the thing with ADHD. It makes me feel a lot better about myself. I was right. I was like, how do I write this down in a dream diary? There's nothing you can even describe about it.
right. Well, I've written about dreams that are unusual and feeling aroused, like being aroused in your dream, like aroused in terms of vigilant, like being vigilant in your during your sleep and having unusual dreams. I have several papers on that, but that's a completely different topic. So I'm just going to answer what you asked me before. You asked, how do I stay motivated? So, at first it was kind of like a side project for me. But then it became more of my main thing just because the more I got into it and the more I heard stories from people who emailed me, they started emailing me as well now. So not just Ellie. So First of all, the stories of the people are very interesting, and the gratitude. They write us and they say, "Oh my God, thank you so much. Please keep researching this. Finally, I have a name for it, and whatever. And thank you, and please do this." And so that's, as a psychologist who wants to help people. That's why I chose this profession. So that definitely affects me. Those emails. So that's one thing, but also over time, I kind of realized all the dissociative properties it really has. So that, again, that made it closer to what I was already interested in, which I'm really interested in the kind of like connection between dissociation and OCD. And that's exactly part of it's exactly like on those crossroads. So I don't know, it's related to stuff that I'm interested in. But you're right. I mean, I'm not a maladaptive daydreamer. I don't have that ability. I don't know. It's interesting still.
I mean, it's good on you for being passionate about it if you don't experience it. I just find that that's like the I has to usually affect me to get interested into something, especially to the point of being like an advocate on some things. I mean, there's things I'll be an advocate for, but it's just I respect that. Thank you for doing what you do. But when it comes to maladaptive daydreaming research, is that subreddit? Like, are you getting a lot of like interesting ideas from people on there that are I've heard about this a couple of times from Dr. Sommer and Jane Rachel when she was on here talking about the subreddit. If it's that large of a group, I wonder if you're getting a wide range of experiences. You could easily just look at certain things, and I'm sure anybody from that group will probably be able to offer whatever experience they have if you're trying to do a specific study on things as well too, because the limited
Well, we've
resources.
we've we've advertised studies there, so I guess that some of our participants have been, some of those consumers. Personally, I don't tend to get ideas from there usually because I don't have time to just look into it. But I have a lot of things on my plate as it is. But my students definitely sometimes, they're on it. Um,
Could I
yeah.
ask what your opinion on social media being raising awareness on some of this stuff? That's where I first came across it was from TikTok. Surprisingly, happened to have a couple videos on there, and I think you put up something about maladaptive daydreaming or ADHD, gets a ton of hits because a lot of people understand it, and they are experiences related to the actual thing. But you start realizing that you're not just alone in it because if there's not a whole lot of talking about a certain thing, you start to feel like I thought ADHD was specifically my personality. And then I find out it's not my personality, which is good and bad. At the same time, I was like, damn, I'm not original. But at the same time, I was like, at least there's a bunch of people out there that understand what I'm going through. And it makes it like a community aspect.
Well, I think that you said it all. There are advantages and disadvantages to social media. So I think that social media is especially important in this field, which is something which is not known or not recognized by the mainstream kind of like the diagnostic categories or psychiatric system. So people kind of need to find each other and say, yeah, you're not alone. I do this too. This is not just you. You're not the weird one. You're not crazy. And this is what people tell us that they felt when they found out that this term existed. That they finally felt like they're not crazy. They're not alone. They're not the only ones. They felt understood. They felt like someone could define them or give them words for what they were experiencing. So in that sense, that's really good. That's a good thing, and that's you can sometimes ask the same about diagnoses in general in the field of mental health. Is a diagnosis a good thing? So on one hand, it's bad because it might promote stigma, but then on the other hand, it's good because people can feel understood and they can feel like, okay, there's a name for my thing, and now it can be researched and we can know the prognosis or explore different treatment options. So it has advantages, and this is the disadvantage. I didn't say the disadvantage is that people talk on social media, and like you said before, they can misunderstand the word daydreaming. So they can diagnose themselves when actually maybe they have something else. Maybe someone with OCD would find this subreddit and believe that they have maladaptive daydreaming, and even maybe be angry at a practitioner who suggests that they have OCD and say, no, you don't understand me, when actually they do have OCD, or maybe they have both. I don't know. So it can cause different things. It's a problem because there's not some like an adult and that like a practitioner or a clinician who gets to know the person and makes a formal diagnosis. So, that could lead to problems. So again, advantages and disadvantages. For some people, it's been really a lifesaver, but then for others, maybe, I don't know, maybe something that's not so good.
You know why movements increase the maladaptive daydream, like repetitive motions and things of that sort? We talked about skin
I
picking,
think
but
that's,
there's
yeah, no,
larger.
I think,
Okay.
no, but there's a larger range of stereotypical movements. No, that's a good question. I think that we don't understand it yet, and we have to do more research. We know that some kids have this mechanism as well. Some people, it starts for them as children. We're actually doing a study together with some pediatricians in Canada and the UK, that they recognized this phenomenon in children called intense imagery movements, where children who had the diagnosis of stereotypical movement disorder, that's actually a diagnosis in childhood, stereotypical movement disorder. Um, some of them report that when they do the stereotypical movement disorder, they have these immersive internal worlds and this intense imagery. And they coined this term unrelatedly. They didn't know the term maladaptive daydreaming. And they published this like in 2011, I think. So it was really like in parallel, these works. And at some point we found each other and we realized that we're researching the same thing, probably only on a different, time scale in terms of developmental trajectories. So we know that children do this as well. They can twirl or pace, or even headbanging has been reported. So there are different types of movements, and for some reason this makes people get into this like hypnotic trance. It's like self hypnosis. It's like kind of like inducing self hypnosis. It gets you into the zone, and we don't understand exactly why. And aside from the stereotypical movements, there is also in maladaptive daydreaming some people who have movements that kind of like embody the content of the daydreaming. So like if you're daydreaming about hugging someone, you might hug a pillow or a doll or something. So some people do movements that are actually in accordance with what they're daydreaming about. And other people do these movements which are stereotypical. So it's really interesting to understand more, and maybe there's a difference between these people and these people. We don't know yet. There's not enough research.
This is a question you might have the answer for, you might not. Just I've just thought of this, and I never asked Dr. Sommer this or Jane this question, but have any of the maladaptive daydreams became violent? I've never heard or experienced myself anything violent. And I don't even know at this point now if I'm experiencing maladaptive daydreaming because I just limit it to cardio, but I can also do it at work. It's not really impeding my life, but I'm wondering if anybody's experiencing things not like getting superpowers, but something violent or something bad, like if their brain just goes negative all of a sudden. I would have to think that there's a strong correlation with OCD because you're trying to control, and this is like, it's like playing Sims. You have to control the space in your head and everything goes your way. I mean, that's perfection right there. But then at the same time, what happens if it goes bad? I know a lot of people that have negative thoughts and things. I don't know if it ever affects a daydream.
Okay, so the thing is, yeah, definitely some people fantasize about violence, um, which is fine as long as it's just in your head. There's nothing wrong with that. Just like sexual fantasies, it's fine. You can fantasize about whatever you want. The thing is with maladaptive daydreaming, it's not necessarily always just good fantasies about things going your way. It can be really various things. Like, for example, one study showed that those who had histories of trauma and maladaptive daydreaming, they had a lot of fantasies about traumas, and they not necessarily like it's not like PTSD flashbacks, that they weren't just thinking about what happened to them. They had these whole storylines where it could be a different trauma from what happened to them, or they could be in a different role. They could be the perpetrator, or they could be a rescuer, or they could be a victim but get rescued. There were different things, different types of fantasies, and this is more similar to someone watching TV. So when you watch TV, when you watch Netflix or whatever, sometimes you would want to watch a tragedy, you would want to watch a horror movie, or different things which are not all just comedies, because this makes you feel. It's a virtual realm that kind of activates emotions, and crying because of a character who dies is not like actually losing someone in your real life, and people get some kind of a pleasure from that. And we can ask why. I mean, personally, by the way, I don't like to watch tragedies. I like feel good stuff, but a lot of people like to watch things that are not feel good, and we could ask why. But it's the same thing. People with maladaptive daydreaming, a lot of people do have fantasies that have tragedies and people dying and bad stuff happening. That's definitely part of, just part of the range that they have. And they have all these different emotions. And again, that's one of the things that my doctoral student recognized, that's different between mind wandering and fantasizing, where you have a range of emotions, a range of different emotions, and very strong, evocative ones. So, yeah.
Another question I'm going to ask, I don't know if you might know the answer to, but have they been able to see from a brain scan if there's certain parts during, like if someone was going to practice maladaptive daydreaming under one of these scans, they could see certain parts that would light up, and what areas of the brain is probably affecting them
So
most?
yeah, so there are not yet any published studies on brain scans, brain waves,
We'll
or
get one
whatever.
eventually. Trust me.
Yeah, there was one starting before COVID, and then when the pandemic started, it couldn't happen. And there's a researcher in Turkey actually who's, I think, working towards that. So I hope that's going to happen soon. I just want to say that I have to finish.
I got you. No, I appreciate the time you gave me to talk on my show, and setting everything up to do everything, the audio and everything. I really do appreciate the time. Is there a place where people can find any of your links that you'd like to promote? I'll make sure I link them in the description.
I have a website, like my lab's website, which has the list of publications. And also we have a website, Ellie and I have, Ellie Zomel, we have a website called the International Consortium for Maladaptive Daydreaming Research, the ICMDR. And there are all the studies there freely available, which you can download. So you can put that link as well.
Okay. And I'll link all those in the description. Like I said, thank you again for giving me the time to talk about this. And thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank Podcast.